we have to have, as I said yesterday, an acceptable distribution of available, necessary goods and services. The environment, which some people will argue is the major focus of environmental justice, although let me tell you, in my experience with contaminated communities and research, it turns out, yes, communities which have been contaminated are concerned with getting the contamination out, but they're really concerned with jobs and their economic plight. And so when you say, when the Environmental Protection Agency comes in to clean up the environment, they say, look, we can do with a little bit of brown, but we'd like to have some jobs here. I mean, because environmental justice, as they define it, is much broader than the environment. And so one really needs to be conscious of the fact that from their perspective, environmental justice is much closer to sustainable development than it is just the environment. I've indicated how important work is: fair working conditions with good health and safety, fair and meaningful employment with purchasing power, and the potential for self-reliance, creativity, innovation, and participation in society and the economy. In other words, social inclusion. Now, that's not vague. It's multidimensional, and it's difficult. And environmental or sustainable development needs to address all of those issues. Now, if we look at the main actors here, and I think it's interesting to look at them, there are characteristics and styles which are in blue, and there are characteristics and styles of governance which are in black. And one can argue that the main economic actors are the government, the corporations, and the consumers, noting that NGOs might have an overlap with that concern, and also shareholders to the corporate stock might have some concern. But look at the different postures that these actors can take. They can be very minimal state in blue participation, which is basically a laissez-faire approach, and we heard a lot about that yesterday. The corporations can simply pursue profit maximization, and you very often hear incorrect legal conclusions that the primary purpose of the corporation is to be responsible to the shareholders. That's not true as a matter of law. Corporations actually have much more responsibility than that, although they'd like to think that you don't. The consumer may just simply looking for value. Whether a product is made safely or not made safely is irrelevant to them unless they think about it. So that's the usual system, which is a market laissez-faire perspective. One could hope to move government into, and I'll expand upon this, a Rawlsian approach, which looks to advantage the least advantaged in moves from this state of the society to a future state. And by the way, John Rawls was a lawyer, and you know his famous work, Justice as Fairness, very, very crucial. He's been criticized as a non-implementable idea. That's actually not true. And while you might not be able to find a definite super Rawlsian definition of distributions, like beauty, or you know it when you see it, and you certainly know non-Rawlsian justice when you see it. You know that for sure. That's not acceptable. From the point of view of corporations, the argument has been, and one of the speakers spoke to, corporate social and environmental responsibility, which I'm sorry to say I think is an oxymoron. I think it ought to be eliminated as a descriptor. If you Google corporate social responsibility, you will find tens of thousands of publications and books, most of them not worth the paper that they're printed on. What I do recommend is a recent work by Utting and Clapp, published by Oxford University Press in India, not in Cambridge, in Oxford, not in New York, which deals with corporate social responsibility and sustainability, where these authors blow the whistle on all this nonsense, which is called corporate social responsibility. We really need to purge this from discussions if one is serious, and I feel extremely strongly about this. And if you don't believe me, read the work. Now, the consumer can be a green consumer, be concerned about issues. Now the question is, how do you move from the blue to the black? Oof, I wouldn't know. Okay, now what I want to do today is to talk about what are the various purposes of stakeholder and community involvement, the vehicles that are used, utilitarian versus Rawlsian approach, and stakeholder inputs versus direct stakeholder involvement, which is very different, and talk about, oh, great, that's good. No, right, that's fine. Scenario building versus backcasting. Well, what are the purposes of involving people in this process of governance? Well, you know, you can focus attention on broad-based outreach, communicate with the environment, hold all kinds of juries and community meetings. Building skills and capability in the community is a valid purpose. Providing for increased community participation and access to government decisions. And a caution. Using the community in this way could be used to legitimize the political process in a narrow sense, or to serve deeper concerns of achieving fairness and equity. And I'm sorry to say that I think the issue of stakeholder and community involvement has been abused by power structures, both within government and within the private sector. The vehicles that they use, you know them all, citizen advisory committees. The real way to involve students, community, and people is direct involvement in decision-making, from the framing of the problem to the choice of methodologies, to the choice of evaluation criterion, to the choice of experts and consultants, to the decisions themselves. You don't bring in the community after everything else is studied and the process and problem has been framed, and then say, gee, we had a workshop and the community didn't raise any objections. Now, the Rawlsian approach to making government responsibility has, from John Rawls, two principles that are key. One is every person should have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. In other words, maximizing liberty is important. But the second principle is to make sure that any movement that occurs advantages the least advantaged more than anybody else. It's not a socialist idea. It isn't a movement to complete equality, but it is a movement away from adverse differential effects. To this, you could add the environment as an independent principle, which of course he was not thinking about, but the environment, and I'm not talking about just having trees having rights in courts. I'm talking about the fact that the environment is something very, very different and may deserve a third principle. Now, this is a very, very important slide. Look, it's not just the government, it's the community too. So you have two different actors. You have the group called stakeholders, and they're not monolithic. In a contaminated community, you have people who own property who want the contamination problem to be suppressed. You've got people whose backyards have ooze coming out of it. You have people who are small business owners. The community is not monolithic, but we have the government under pressure from the community to do something, to clean up the community, to do something. There are two postures that both groups could take. One would be utilitarian, and one would be Rawlsian. Now, as a utilitarian, what they basically want to do is have the greatest good for the greatest number, and a utilitarian community means that the people who go to the meetings get what they want. All the other people who are hidden, who don't understand the process, are not included. And all these people may care about is getting the ooze out of their backyards, and these people are going to respond. That is not a Rawlsian solution. If the government is Rawlsian, it will say, look, there are other people here too. There's the benefit of the total community as a whole. There are people who are not represented. And the community itself can be what is called, and we used the word before, communitarian. In the work that I did in St. Louis, which is where the atomic bomb fissionable material was made, there were radioactive pilings under the schoolyard. The community yelled like hell at the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy said, we could do this, we could do that. And the community said, we want it moved, we want it moved, we want it moved. Finally, the Department of Energy says, fine, we're going to move it. And then somebody from the community said, where are you going to move it? Oh, we're going to put it on an Indian reservation in the western part of the United States. And the community said, like hell you are. You're not going to take this problem and move it to an Indian community. They exhibited, because if all they cared about was themselves, would just get it out, we don't care. In fact, they cared about what happened. If you have a government that is dedicated to fairness and a population that is dedicated to fairness, you get the upper right-hand corner. You get a very different result. And I would argue that one of the challenges of law and the challenges of policy is to move people from utilitarian to...
Can we make this the final slide, please? And you can come back later.
I'll do my best. Let me talk about the difference, since you insist that I go to the final slide. Two different ways in which you can do some planning. You can do scenario analysis, which builds images of the future from existing trends. And you can say, well, where are we going and what should we be doing? The trouble with that is that it promotes incremental change. Backcasting is something which the Dutch scholars have invented. It says, where do you want to be in 2050? Where do you want to be in 2020? And what do we have to do today to get there? It's not forecasting, it's backcasting. And that issue is an extraordinarily important issue. Let me say just one more word, and that is in the law, we make a great deal of emphasis between what is called fair process and fair outcome. And people argue, well, if we don't know what the fair process is, outcome is, at least we can propose a fair process. It was about the story of the guy, two people in the Balkans who only had enough money to buy a lamb shank dinner. So they bought this lamb shank, and it turns out, if you know what a lamb shank is, it's a very amorphous piece of meat with a bone. So they decided the first guy would cut it, the second guy would take first choice. Well, as it had it, the first guy cut it, tried to cut it in equal portions, but one was almost all bone and one was meat. Now, he says to his friend, okay, we've decided on a process, you take your choice. And the man took the piece that was all meat. And then the first guy said, oh, you're really selfish. I mean, you left me with a bone. I've got no food. He says, but look, we decided on this process. And they argued and argued. Finally said, look, if it had been the other way around, if I had cut it and you had had a chance to take the first piece, what would you have taken? He says, I would have taken the bone. He says, you got the bone. What are you complaining about? Now, so this distinction between process and outcome always assumes that somebody has the outcomes in mind. The surprise is the process does not always give you the expected outcome. So this is of a sham of a distinction. You have to confront what you want the outcomes to be, and you have to designate law in order to get you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I was going to say that I want to adopt a Rawlsian approach to this discussion and give time for the least eloquent person to play a part, but I'm slightly confused now as to what the Rawlsian approach would involve. But anyway, thank you very much to all our panelists. Now, I think the best way to deal with this, we'll just have to see how many contributions there are, but my inclination at the moment is to just invite contributions one after the other, not bring the panel back in, because otherwise we won't get people speaking. Bring the panel in, I'm warning them of this now, for a couple of minutes at the end. So feel free to make your contribution, but can I ask you please, firstly, to say who you are and where you come from, and secondly, please, to be brief, make 1 point, don't make 2 or 3 or 4 or 15 points, make 1 point, and then if there's time, you can come back and make another. Okay, so let's take Professor Harris first, please.
Thank you for telling everybody who I am, so I don't have to do that. And obviously, I qualify as the least eloquent person in the room, so we've established that as well. I actually had 1 point to make, but to 3 separate speakers.